This is the story of a 5'5", balding computer salesman from Queens who walked into 7 of the world's biggest banks, told every single one of them the exact same lie, and walked out with over $350 million. John Rufo pulled it off between 1993 and 1996. And on the morning of November 9th, 1998, the day he owed the federal government 17 and a half years of his life, he withdrew $600 from an ATM in Queens, drove to JFK Airport, and vanished from the face of the earth. Nobody has confirmed a sighting of him since. 27 years running, the U.S. Marshals have kept him on their 15 most wanted fugitives list, with a $25,000 reward that remains uncollected. What separates this case from every other white-collar crime story is the laziness of the method. Rufo didn't hack into computer systems, he didn't forge checks, and he didn't threaten anybody. He used one forged document and one confidentiality trick, pitched them to bank after bank after bank, and never once bothered to change the script. Every bank fell for it. John Joseph Rufo came into the world on November 26, 1954, in Brooklyn, New York, born into a close-knit Italian-American family with working-class roots. A scholarship carried him to New York University, where he earned a degree in computer science, and by May of 1980, he'd married his childhood sweetheart, a woman named Linda. Through the 80s and into the early 90s, Rufo built a company called Consolidated Computer Services, or CCS for short, an IBM equipment reseller operating out of Midtown Manhattan. Glasses, a mustache, a modest attached house in Queens. Nothing about his appearance or lifestyle screamed wealth or ambition. Linda had no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. But here's where it gets strange. Sometime in the early 90s, the FBI contracted with CCS to use it as a front while agents tracked Soviet operatives in New York, which meant Rufo served as a bureau informant during that stretch. When the FBI eventually raided his offices years later, investigators turned up a photograph of Rufo standing alongside the assistant director of the FBI's New York office and their SWAT team. That photograph, and what it implies about his connections, becomes extremely relevant later in this story. People close to Rufo described him as a man who loved to stretch the truth and had an almost compulsive need to impress anyone in the room. Linda would eventually tell reporters that he was really good at keeping secrets, and Deputy U.S. Marshal Barry Borite, who spent years chasing him, boiled the man down to one sentence. Borite called Rufo a pathological liar, adding that half of everything in his life was a lie. Everything traces back to a single lunch at an Italian restaurant in Manhattan, sometime around 1992 or 93. Rufo sat across the table from a man named Edward Rhiners, a former Philip Morris USA executive who'd spent 20 years running technology projects inside the company's information systems department, before a layoff in July of 1992 ended his career there. 2 decades of work had given Rhiners something money can't buy, which was genuine, established, trusted relationships with the banks that financed Philip Morris's technology purchases. The pitch they cooked up over that lunch was simple enough. They would approach major banks and explain that Philip Morris had a massive, top-secret technology initiative in the works, a project they called Project Star. Rhiners would present himself as the company's authorized representative, using his 20 years of real credentials to sell the story. The banks would lend enormous sums to finance IBM computer equipment for the project, and Rufo and Rhiners would funnel the cash into the stock market, repay the banks with their trading profits, and pocket whatever remained. Pulling this off required one specific piece of paper: a corporate incumbency certificate, which is a letter from a company confirming that a named individual has the authority to do business on its behalf. They needed this document to appear as though it came from Philip Morris, signed by a real Philip Morris officer. And the method they used to get that signature is one of the most creative acts of forgery on record. While riding through Manhattan in a taxi, they heard a radio station running a prize giveaway, and that gave them their idea. They identified an executive at Philip Morris named Diane McAdams, the assistant corporate secretary, then called her pretending to represent the radio station. The story they fed her was that she'd won a free dinner at a high-end Manhattan restaurant, and all she had to do was sign a release form and send it back. McAdams signed the form and mailed it in, not knowing that her handwritten signature went straight onto a forged Philip Morris incumbency certificate. A shop in Lower Manhattan that manufactured corporate seals filled their final need, no questions asked. They ordered a Philip Morris Company's seal, stamped the document, and suddenly they had a certificate that looked completely authentic. Armed with that single piece of paper, they walked into the first bank. Forging the document was only half the operation. What really made this scheme bulletproof was a single clause buried inside every deal, a confidentiality agreement that shut down any possibility of verification. Every bank that agreed to participate in financing Project Star had to sign this agreement, and the language was strict. Because of the extreme sensitivity of the project, all communication had to go through Edward Rhiners alone. Direct contact with Philip Morris was forbidden. Rhiners even warned the banks that if anyone tried to reach Philip Morris on their own, the company would disavow all knowledge of the project. 7 sophisticated banking institutions, stretching from Signet Banking Corporation in Richmond to the Long-Term Credit Bank of Japan in Tokyo, signed that clause. Not a single one pushed back. And that's where Rhiners' 2 decades of legitimate Philip Morris experience paid off in full. These weren't cold calls to strangers. Rhiners had arranged real computer leasing deals with several of these banks during his career there. Signet Bank, Nations Bank, the Bank of Montreal. These institutions had done genuine business with him for over 10 years. They weren't trusting a name on a page. They were trusting a man they'd sat across from at meetings for a decade. On top of all that, Rufo and Rhiners kept the scheme alive by making timely interest payments on the early loans using cash from newly obtained ones. Payments arrived on schedule, the project appeared to be humming along, and the banks kept writing checks. Rhiners captured the absurdity of it perfectly when he appeared on CBS's 60 Minutes years later. His exact words to Steve Croft were, "I had a harder time getting a home mortgage than I did getting these loans. $350 million. That's the total amount Rufo and Rhiners extracted from 7 banks over roughly 2 years, between 1993 and 1996. Signet Banking Corporation alone handed over $81 million and then helped syndicate approximately $173 million to other lenders. Nations Bank contributed roughly $70 million on its own. None of that money sat idle. Approximately $180 million flowed into stock market positions, with $66.5 million going into Texas Instruments, $27 million into Philip Morris, $17 million into IBM, and $14 million into Netscape. Rhiners, meanwhile, treated himself to a penthouse unit at Trump Palace condominium in New York City, purchased for $9.4 million. And through all of this, through hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through accounts Rufo controlled, he kept living in that same modest attached house in Queens with Linda. She had no idea any of it was happening. Her words, years later, were plain. She told reporters, "We were living in a simple little attached house in Queens, and that he was not living a millionaire's lifestyle." The man handling $1/3 billion in stolen money commuted home every night to a life that looked completely ordinary. For roughly 2 years, the scheme held together without a crack. What finally broke it open was a single fax and a banker careful enough to follow up. On March 15, 1996, Masanori Shoji, a deputy general manager at the Long-Term Credit Bank of Japan's New York office, faxed a copy of the suspicious incumbency certificate directly to the real Diane McAdams at Philip Morris headquarters. McAdams confirmed that same day that the document was a forgery and that Rhiners had zero authority to act on behalf of the company. One phone call, or in this case one fax, and the entire $350 million house of cards collapsed in an afternoon. 4 days later, on March 19th, the FBI staged a sting at Philip Morris's offices in Rye Brook, New York. Agents arrested Rhiners on the spot. They also picked up a CCS employee named Jody Batcherman, a single mother earning $30,000 a year from Cliffside Park, New Jersey, who Rufo and Rhiners had recruited to impersonate Diane McAdams during face-to-face meetings with nervous bankers. Batcherman genuinely believed she was working on a legitimate government project, and the charges against her were eventually dropped. Over at Signet Bank in Richmond, a senior credit manager named Robert Merrick broke the news to colleagues with 6 words that probably stopped a few hearts. Merrick told them, "We have a major problem," and then explained that the Nelco deal was a fraud. Nelco Limited, the legitimate computer leasing company in Richmond that had unknowingly served as the middleman for the entire scheme, would later be pushed into bankruptcy. When the FBI finished tracing the money, agents managed to freeze approximately $200 million, but about $13 million was never recovered. And that $13 million is the number investigators believe Rufo had access to when he decided to run. FBI agent Jack Mullaney arrested Rufo in March of 1997. A federal grand jury returned an indictment on more than 150 counts of bank fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. For over a year, the case ground through the system until April of 1998, when Rufo pleaded guilty to 47 of those counts, just days before his trial was scheduled to begin. Sentencing took place in a Richmond, Virginia courtroom. 17.5 years in federal prison. Officers immediately locked handcuffs around Rufo's wrists, but his attorney, Jeffrey Lichtman, objected on the spot, pointing to a pre-existing agreement that allowed Rufo to surrender himself to prison on his own schedule. The judge turned to the prosecutor with what was described as an incredulous look, and the prosecutor confirmed the agreement stood. Off came the handcuffs, and Rufo boarded a flight back to New York alongside his lawyer, a free man with roughly 5 weeks to get his affairs in order before reporting to begin his sentence. That report date never came. On the morning of November 9th, 1998, Rufo dropped Linda at a train station, then drove to a Brooklyn courthouse and returned his ankle monitor. After that, he rented a Ford Taurus, stopped at an ATM in Queens, where a security camera captured the last confirmed image of him withdrawing $600, and drove to JFK International Airport. The rental car turned up abandoned in the long-term parking lot. That evening, an FBI agent called Linda at home and asked where John Rufo was. She had no answer. When she got back to the house, a suicide note was waiting. Neither Linda nor the FBI gave it much weight. Investigators pointed out that Rufo had reportedly written in the note that he had beat the federal government, and dying would mean the opposite of beating anything. No body surfaced, no death certificate was filed, and no remains were ever found. Within 3 months of his disappearance, the government moved to seize the homes of 6 sets of family members who had put up their properties as collateral for his $10 million bail. Among those who lost their homes were Rufo's mother, his mother-in-law, his wife, and several other relatives, most of them in their 70s and 80s. Linda described the fallout to CNBC's American Greed, and the pain in her words was raw. She told them, "There are all these little people, elderly people, so innocent and naive, and we just signed away everything." Rufo landed on the U.S. Marshals' 15 Most Wanted Fugitives list, which is the highest priority designation the Marshals Service assigns to any case. Wanted posters went out in 7 languages to law enforcement agencies around the world. April of 2000. One brought the first potential sighting. A man matching Rufo's description walked into community banks in Duncan, Oklahoma, using his real name, trying to open accounts to receive $250 million in wire transfers from Nigeria. By the time local police reached his motel, the room sat empty. Then in 2016, a cousin named Carmine Pascal caught something while watching a Dodgers game on television. A man in the crowd at Dodger Stadium looked exactly like an older version of Rufo, the US. Marshals eventually released that image to the public in October of 2021, tracked down the fan in the photograph, and brought him in for fingerprinting. The prints came back clean. Wrong man. Every lead has dried up, and the investigators who have spent years and in some cases decades pursuing this case carry a mix of frustration and something that sounds an awful lot like grudging respect. US. Marshal Jeff Shank captured both feelings when he spoke to NPR back in 2009. Shank admitted that yes, the case made him angry, and yes, he still thought about Rufo that very day. Then he added, "I think he's in a cafe on a cobblestone street somewhere, drinking espresso." But Shank also offered a warning that hasn't expired. "They have to be lucky every day," he told NPR. "We only have to be lucky once." 2 unresolved controversies continue to shadow this case, and neither one has a satisfying answer. The first involves The self-surrender agreement. Federal prosecutors allowed a man convicted of defrauding banks of over $350 million, a man with international connections and obvious means to flee, to walk out of the courtroom and report to prison on his own timeline. Chief Deputy U.S. Marshal John Boland put the law enforcement perspective into words that cut straight to the bone. Boland stated that being sentenced to 210 months of incarceration and not serving a single day sticks in the craw of those of us in this profession, and called Rufo's actions a mockery to our justice system. The second controversy runs even deeper. Rufo's confirmed history as an FBI informant, the Bureau's use of his company as a front operation, and the photograph proving his relationship with senior FBI leadership in New York all feed a theory that has circled the case for decades. Former CCS employee John Von Arnen stated it without hedging. Von Arnen told ABC News that he believes to this day there's got to be somebody in that FBI that helped Rufo escape. Adding fuel to the suspicion is the fact that the FBI initially withheld Rufo's informant status from the U.S. Marshals tasked with finding him. No evidence has surfaced to confirm Von Arnen's belief, but the silence around it has done nothing to put the theory to rest. John Rufo would be 71 years old today. The U.S. Marshals' current theory places him overseas, living under an assumed identity, and their director, Donald Washington, stated in 2020 that Rufo is likely well established and comfortable in whatever alias he is living under. One unusual physical detail could still give him away, though. Rufo had extremely short, wide feet, a size 8 EE, which required him to custom order every pair of shoes he owned. Edward Rhiners, the co-conspirator who spent 20 years at Philip Morris before helping build the entire scheme, served approximately 9 years in federal prison and has been free since roughly 2009. When NBC News caught up with him in 2018, Rhiners offered just 9 words about the man who disappeared. "He's gone," Rhiners told them. "God bless him. He beat the system." Linda remarried and rebuilt her life, but the questions never stopped circling. She once told NBC News exactly what she would say to Rufo if she ever got the chance. Her words were, "I want to face him. I want to tell him how bad he hurt his mother and everybody else. And I'd like to ask him, when did you stop loving me? What happened? When did money become so important that you could do this to us?" 7 banks. 1 forged document. 1 confidentiality clause that prevented every single one of them from picking up the phone and verifying that Project Star existed. That's all it would have taken. 1 call. And the man who exploited that failure for over $350 million has been gone for more than a quarter century, leaving behind broken families, empty homes, and a wanted poster translated into 7 languages that still hangs in federal offices around the world. Anyone with information about John Rufo's whereabouts can contact the U.S. Marshals at 1-800-336-0102. The $25,000 reward remains active and unclaimed,